Again, for those that just signed in, we're asking 2 poll questions. So please answer number 1, are race and biology the same thing? And the second question I'm asking everyone to answer is, research for disease markers might often be linked to race, but should they instead be linked to ancestry, genetics, or a geographic location? So those are the 2 questions I'm asking everyone to answer in our poll. And Janine, you could proceed whenever you're ready. Oh, Janine, you're muted. Let me unmute you here.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, I think there's an option to share the poll. Does it let you do that? To share the results? Okay. So let's see what our results are. And this is a tricky question, so don't feel badly if you don't know. So for number 1, are race and biology the same thing? And so many of you said no, some of you said yes, and some of you were honest and said, I don't know. And I appreciate the honesty in that question. And I think that's part of what we're going to touch on tonight, right? Is that race and biology are not the same thing, but we're going to talk about why. And number 2, this one's a hard one. Research for disease markers might often be linked to race, but should they instead be linked to ancestry, genetics, or geographic location? So for those of you that answered ancestry and geographic location, that's correct. And it's wonderful. I'm going to show Reverend Dr. Johnson's book, Medical Stigmata, Race, Medicine, and the Pursuit of Theological Liberation. And in this book, and I'm not going to steal your spotlight, Kirk, but I just love the way that you phrased the answers to these questions. So if you have the book, it's on page 97. Dr. Johnson says, it is the ancestry and geographic location that should inform research for disease markers, not race. And I found this fascinating on page 98. He says, there is not genetic proof that African Americans are genetically different than other racial groups. Consequently, Africans and African Americans are more genetically diverse among each other. And I thought that was incredible because that's not the way as Americans and on our race-based understanding that we're taught to think about this. So I'm going to let Reverend Dr. Johnson take over. And if you guys, again, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we will have a nice time of question and answer at the end. So feel free, if your question can't wait, just put it in the chat and we'll address all of them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Janine. So I'll go ahead and dive right in. So let me share my screen. We're going to start off with a video.
When ultraviolet sunlight hits our skin, it affects each of us a little differently. Depending on skin color, it'll take only minutes of exposure to turn one person beetroot pink, while another requires hours to experience the slightest change. So what's to account for that difference, and how did our skin come to take on so many different hues to begin with? Whatever the color, our skin tells an epic tale of human intrepidness and adaptability, revealing its variance to be a function of biology. It all centers around melanin, the pigment that gives skin and hair its color. This ingredient comes from skin cells called melanocytes and takes 2 basic forms. There's eumelanin, which gives rise to a range of brown skin tones as well as black, brown, and blonde hair, and pheomelanin, which causes the reddish browns of freckles and red hair. But humans weren't always like this. Our varying skin tones were formed by an evolutionary process driven by the sun. It began some 50,000 years ago when our ancestors migrated north from Africa and into Europe and Asia. These ancient humans lived between the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn, a region saturated by the sun's UV-carrying rays. When skin is exposed to UV for long periods of time, the UV light damages the DNA within our cells, and skin starts to burn. If that damage is severe enough, the cell's mutations can lead to melanoma, a deadly cancer that forms in the skin's melanocytes. Sunscreen as we know it today didn't exist 50,000 years ago. So how did our ancestors cope with this onslaught of UV? The key to survival lay in their own personal sunscreen, manufactured beneath the skin, melanin. The type and amount of melanin in your skin determines whether you'll be more or less protected from the sun. This comes down to the skin's response as sunlight strikes it. When it's exposed to UV light, that triggers special light-sensitive receptors called rhodopsin, which stimulate the production of melanin to shield cells from damage. For light-skinned people, that extra melanin darkens their skin and produces a tan. Over the course of generations, humans living at the sun-saturated latitudes in Africa adapted to have a higher melanin production threshold and more eumelanin, giving skin a darker tone. This built-in sun shield helped protect them from melanoma, likely making them evolutionarily fitter and capable of passing this useful trait on to new generations. But soon, some of our sun-adapted ancestors migrated northward out of the tropical zone, spreading far and wide across the Earth. The further north they traveled, the less direct sunshine they saw. This was a problem, because although UV light can damage skin, it also has an important parallel benefit. UV helps our bodies produce vitamin D, an ingredient that strengthens bones and lets us absorb vital minerals like calcium, iron, magnesium, phosphate, and zinc. Without it, humans experience serious fatigue and weakened bones that can cause a condition known as rickets. For humans whose dark skin effectively blocked whatever sunlight there was, vitamin D deficiency would have posed a serious threat in the north. But some of them happened to produce less melanin. They were exposed to small enough amounts of light that melanoma was less likely, and their lighter skin better absorbed the UV light. So they benefited from vitamin D, developed strong bones, and survived well enough to produce healthy offspring. Over many generations of selection, skin color in those regions gradually lightened. As a result of our ancestors' adaptability, today the planet is full of people with a vast palette of skin colors. Typically, darker eumelanin-rich skin in the hot, sunny band around the equator, and increasingly lighter pheomelanin-rich skin shades fanning outwards as the sunshine dwindles. Therefore, skin color is little more than an adaptive trait for living on a rock that orbits the sun. It may absorb light, but it certainly does not reflect character.
Right. So that is an introductory video for a very popular TED Talk, or specifically TED Ed. And I wanted to start with that particular video because we think that skin color, unfortunately, in our American history, is actually biological, and it is not. It's based on our anthropological history, or anthropology, the study of our human history of humanity in itself, or in ourselves. But as we know in our American history, skin color, unfortunately, has been used to treat certain groups one way, and of course, another particular group a different way. In front of you, you see a book cover, Medical Stigmata, Race, Medicine, and Pursuit of Theological Liberation. And I'll be highlighting chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, little snippets from the particular book. And of course, I'll answer more questions about for whoever's interested, who would like to buy the book, where the book is available. So the learning objectives of this particular lecture, number one, to obtain basic knowledge of race-based medicine's origin. So I'll explain what exactly is race-based medicine. Number two, analyze racial epidemiological attributions to certain minority groups. Epidemiology is the study of illness and disease. And certain racial groups were attributed certain diseases and illnesses based on the color of their skin, which of course is false. And of course, I'll go into detail about that. And third, learning objective of this particular lecture, evaluate religious and theological solutions that advocate against the usage of race as a proxy for therapeutics and the usage of race in sacred texts. So in the early 19th century, French biologist, individual on the left, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, formulated his cornerstone theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics called Lamarckianism, which affirmed, and I quote, environmental forces both favorable and unfavorable could alter human heredity and be transmitted down the familial line. Lamarck's theory influenced Robert Knox's Races of Men in 1850, Arthur Gabineau's Essays in Equality of Human Races in 1853, and Friedrich Max Müller's idea of an Aryan race, which was created in 1853. So when you hear the term Aryan race, this officially was coined by an individual named Friedrich Max Müller in 1853. However, Lamarck's idea was embedded in the belief of what we call degenerationism, which focused on the development of organs, specifically the tailbone, wisdom teeth, etc. On an important note, a similar theological view or understanding in the realm of theology of degenerationism called polygenism was prevalent around the 16th century. Polygenism suggests that the human race has descended from two or more ancestral types. I will discuss polygenism in detail later on in this presentation. Degenerationism raised the fear that certain organs would lose their function and structure by each passing generation. Lamarck, most influential follower of neo-Lamarckianism, of course, is this individual to the right, known as Charles Darwin. On November 24th, 1859, English naturalist Charles Robert Darwin's book, the famous or infamous The Origin of Species, quickly became a significant work of modern biological theory. He stressed the use, neglect, and deterioration in organ development, including how the environment acts directly on organic structures, which describe an organism's livelihood and environment. The two key famous theories from Darwin's work were evolution and natural selection. Evolution is a biological theory suggesting all types of living beings have their origin in pre-existing beings, and distinguishable differences resulted from modifications in successive generations. In other words, evolution is how we as humans continue to evolve and change from generation to generation. The second theory, natural selection, is a process that results in the adaptation of an organism to its environment by means of selectively reproducing changes in its genotype or genetic constitution. In other words, natural selection is how our environment changes we as human beings from generation to generation. Evolution and natural selection were the foundational tools in the development of what we now know as social Darwinism. Consequently, the idea might makes right proceeded before Darwin's Origin of the Species book. Surprisingly, the survival of the fittest, quote unquote, ideology or idea did not come from Darwin. And I repeat that, the survival of the fittest idea did not come from Charles Darwin, but from a social philosopher in front of you named Herbert Spencer, who created the phrase in 1864 and professed, and I quote, "This survival of the fittest, which I have here sought to express in mechanical terms, is that which Mr. Darwin has called, quote unquote, natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life." So Spencer's idea was adopted into social Darwinism and developed into its own influence and interpretation for racial survival. Through social Darwinism, it was wrong and unethical to help the weak because such actions aid in the survival and reproduction of what he deemed those who were less fit, which threatened the progress and survival of the strong and equipped. Social Darwinism asserted the strongest or the fittest should flourish in society. Darwinism brought the idea to a level of unprecedented consciousness in our society. Darwin made his mark on biology, but it is equally fitting to point out that this individual, Herbert Spencer, was a huge voice in the late 19th century. Suggested ideologies continued evolution of groups and individuals to a higher level from generation to generation, naturally without any interference by any institution. Herbert Spencer was so influential that he sold over 1 million books in his lifetime, which in the early 1900s and of course late 1800s was huge at the time. So Darwin and Spencer's theories set the foundation for an emerging movement that would change the concept of American life called eugenics. Eugenics is the belief or study in the possibility of improving the qualities of human species or human population. Its creator, yes, not Charles Darwin, but Francis Galton, who happened to be Charles Darwin's cousin, developed the phrase eugenics, which he formerly called race hygiene in 1883. Eugenics in the Greek, EU, meaning well or good, and genesis, to come into being or to be born. Galton believed the control and breeding of human beings was a possible goal through the use of statistics. An example of this was in his works. In the Macmillan magazine, that you see on the left, and Galton's Hereditary Genius defended his stance for nature over nurture. He spent the next 40 years of his particular life advocating for the use of eugenics in society. Galton stressed the concept of immanence for a better society. He defined eminent individuals or eminent people are groups possessing high ranking, distinguished, or prominent socioeconomic statuses in society. Eminent pedigree for him had to do with environment, culture, and education. In Galton's mindset, eminent humans produce more eminent humans, and vice versa. Individuals that were not deemed to be pure or eminent produce individuals who were also unpure and uneminent or ineminent, or as he called them, mediocre human beings. Galton used the 1865 edition of Dictionary of Men and of Time and obituaries to record the eminence of individuals. Galton estimated that 1 in 4,000 men, particularly in Britain, qualified as eminent. Notice he did not mention women, he just only mentioned men. Close relatives of the eminent are much more likely to be eminent than distant ones. Galton's promoted eugenics, influenced by the founding of the Society of Race Hygiene in 1905 and the British Eugenics Society in 1907. Darwin, Spencer, and Galton's work produced 2 schools of eugenics. The first school is positive eugenics, and then the second is negative eugenics. Positive eugenics asserted human breeding should be controlled to produce genetically superior human beings. Negative eugenics asserted the improvement of humanity can only happen by eliminating or excluding genetically inferior human beings. What's the difference between these two? Well, of course, positive eugenics is arguments that are based today by what we know as human genome editing or CRISPR technology, or the coined term designer babies, that we actually have the ability, based on our understanding of human genetics, to literally tailor make babies. That is what positive eugenics is, but we don't call that in the 21st century. We call it gene editing. Negative eugenics, unfortunately, are the atrocities of the Holocaust, where, of course, Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany and the Nazi Party exterminated Jews because he felt that they were genetically inferior. So these are the distinctions between what positive genetics is and what negative eugenics is historically and currently. Francis Galton was a positive eugenicist. So he was concerned with and only with improving and enhancing humanity. Negative eugenics was more accepted into theory and practice in the United States, which became the blueprint for, as I stated earlier, the German eugenics movement, influencing the justification of the Holocaust. American geneticist and zoologist, as you see in front of you, Charles B. Davenport, visited London and dined with Francis Galton, again, Charles Darwin's cousin. The meeting dramatically changed Davenport's ideas of biology. His book, Statistical Methods with Special Reference to Biological Variation, was primarily influenced by Galton. Davenport's encounter with the founding fathers of eugenics changed American social policy and biology in the early 20th century and established Davenport as the father of American eugenics. So Davenport literally is the father of American eugenics and introduced eugenics through his resources and network in our American history. Davenport's influence in America was unraveled. In 1904, Davenport received a grant from Andrew Carnegie, one of the famous tycoons of the early 20th century, from the Carnegie Institution to establish and become the director of the Station of Experimental Evolution at Cold Harbor, Long Island, which performed breeding experiments on animals and plants. Specifically, he focused on genetic makeup of family pedigree differing from Galton, who focused on external characteristics. Through his Andrew Carnegie grant, Davenport developed a record of families by sending surveys and questionnaires to public institutions like high schools, colleges, and yes, even churches. He received hundreds of survey results with which Davenport concluded insanity, epilepsy, alcoholism, and the old school term pauperism, and pauperism meaning the poor or those who live in poverty, and especially feeble-mindedness, which is an old school term meaning mentally incompetent or deficient individuals, were all hereditary conditions. His goals for eugenics progressed to a wider scale as he mapped out the genetic health of the entire United States. In 1909, Davenport meets with psychologist Herbert H. Goddard, the individual in front of your screen. He's the first translator of the Binet-Simon intelligence test into English, and encouraged Goddard to read British biologist and creator of the Punnett Square, R.C. Punnett, in 1909, his 1909 book, Mendelism. The Binet-Simon intelligence tests were from French physicians Albert Binet and Theodore Simon to evaluate which children needed assistance in class. So the actual standardized tests that we have, the ACT and the SATs, were actually rooted within the eugenics movement. And Herbert Goddard is a huge influential figure in American standardized testing, along with Alfred Bennett and Theodore Simon. Davenport convinced Goddard feeble-mindedness, again, that old school term meaning mentally deficient, in children and others were inherited conditions that he called unit characteristics, which were later called genes, traced by family genealogy. The Binet-Simon intelligence test was the key influence again in American standardized testing and the skewed procedure that categorized individuals with mental difficulties defined by, again, eugenics. In 1910, Davenport, with the aid of a huge donation from the widow of a railroad tycoon, E.H. Harriman, established and directed the Eugenics Record Office, known as the ERO, with Harry H. Laughlin, the individual on your screen, as the superintendent of the American Eugenics Record Office. This particular office instantaneously became the mecca for eugenicists, eugenics research, social policy like immigration, housing and zoning, publications, and of course, political propaganda. In 1911, Davenport redefined eugenics as, quote, the science of the improvement of the human race by better breeding. To accomplish eugenics, we apply science to the problems of what he called a class-ridden and socially heterogeneous or diverse society. After Davenport and Laughlin, there were many eugenicists who shaped American and European culture, like Irvin Fisher, who's the founder of the American Eugenics Society, Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, Alfred Plotz, the founder of German eugenics, Eugen Fischer, the German eugenic anthropologist, and Franz Lenz, who was also a German race hygienicist. Davenport's racial classifications determined the school you went to, along with Harry Laughlin, what cemetery you were buried in, where you lived, your fertility control, who you married, which created the first official American categorization of races. So every 10 years, we fill out the US Census form. Where did that come from? It was deeply rooted within Harry H. Laughlin and also Charles Davenport's American Eugenics Record Office, which categorized people in different particular labels and categories themselves. Davenport, as well as Laughlin, influenced the United States of Management of Budget Office, which constructed racial and ethnic categories used to collect, organize, and analyze the country's demographic data. His classification of race combined with his interest in Mendelism suggested race not only affected intellectual ability, but human ailments of diseases. So Davenport's and Laughlin's findings were based in his 1908 Inheritance in Canary study, which influenced the idea of disease and intelligence being associated with certain racial groups. Eugenics, as we are exploring, has informed therapeutic intervention or has informed medical practice towards diseases and illnesses that are prevalent in specific minority groups. Race-based medicine has the same principle. Eugenic ideologies or ideas, and later continued through race-based medicine, embrace what Dr. David McBride called socio-medical racialism, which were diseases were classified and attributed to certain racial groups. Through eugenics justification, diseases and illnesses associated with certain racial groups should be treated because not only the disease affects the specific group, but it affects the entire society. In the early 20th century, eugenic perceptions of African Americans as genetically unfit, inferior, and mentally incompetent resulted in a constructive perception of Black folks as a national health threat. Eugenic concepts were used to influence disease, diagnosis on racial, biological, and also on the political landscape. Eugenics left African Americans associated with the socially unfit. One example of this is through sickle cell anemia. And again, this is a picture of the American Eugenics office, which was an actual house. And this house, I believe, still exists today. So with sickle cell anemia, falls under hematology, which is the study of blood and blood disorders and blood diseases. Before Western recognition of the disease, indigenous Ghanaian African tribes described sickle cell anemia in different ways. Tribes like the Ga, the Fenty, the Iwi, and the Akan had different descriptions for sickle cell anemia symptoms. Africans were not concerned about the disease itself, but with the chronic pain the disease sickle cell anemia caused to fellow tribe members. In contrast, Western culture was more concerned with the disease as a public health concern for the well-being of those individuals eugenically and socially accepted. In the early 20th century, American medicine rediscovered sickle cell anemia through Dr. James B. Herrick. So of course, we have our African tribes that discovered sickle cell anemia, and the key word, it was rediscovered in America by Dr. James B. Herrick. Study and interest of sickle cell anemia was growing modestly within the medical community and society, in American society as a whole. The concern was a result of the fear of a pandemic rather than the health and wellness of African Americans who were viewed, again, less genetically fit. The future of America depended on the understanding and the control of what they perceived the medical establishment as the Black health threat. An idea that came from health statistician in front of you, Frederick L. Hoffman, in his 1896 study, Race, Traits, and the Tendencies of the American Negro and the Surgical Peculiarities of the Negro, by surgeon Rudolph Mattis, which were, quote, the standard references for medical and sociological research through World War I, postulating race distinctions as the basis for the Black-white health discrepancy. So Hoffman was hugely influential in the early stages of American medicine, dating back, of course, in the late 1800s, but definitely in the early 1900s and well within the 20th century. Hoffman's publishing influenced an ideology that race was the cause of health disparities, which influenced Davenport's racial and hematological classifications. So when you go back in history and you see medical history and you see what particular work laid the foundation that really set the precedent connecting race with disease, it is definitely, or arguably definitely, Frederick L. Hoffman's Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro, his particular work. The technique that heightened targeted disease classification towards race was Victor Emmel's blood test. In 1916, Victor Emmel, who was an anatomist at the University of Washington, created a blood technique that was a central method for identifying and detecting sickle cells. So how do we actually know or detect sickle cells today? It was through Victor Emmel's particular research. And unfortunately, I could not find an accurate picture of Victor Emmel, so that's why I'm not showing him currently. But I definitely wanted to emphasize and mention him because he's also very influential regarding sickle cell anemia and this particular disease that still plagues so many people today. So sickle cell anemia affects not only African Americans, but groups from India, or Indian, Asian, Saudi Arabian, and Mediterranean backgrounds. Sickle cell anemia has been deemed the Black disease due to medical science, medical literature, and anthropological eugenic influences. But sickle cell anemia was perceived as a plague brought by Black people, but factually, it was an immunity towards malaria. So sickle cell anemia has been marketed and actually illustrated and demonstrated solely and exclusively as a disease from the African diaspora, which is medically and hematologically inaccurate. If your ancestry is from the Mediterranean geographic region, you also can have sickle cell disease. And now there actually are in the Indians and Asians and Saudi Arabians and other individuals from Mediterranean backgrounds that have sickle cell anemia. So it's not just African American or a Black illness. But of course, based on eugenics thinking, which influences on how we think about race and disease today. So since sickle cell anemia was viewed as a disease exclusively possessed by African American individuals with sickle cell anemia, were instantly categorized as Black or Black individuals. Emmel's test was used to justify the individual in front of you. Eugenicist Walter A. Plecker's one-drop rule, meaning that one drop of Negro or Black blood makes you Black. So this is an age-old saying, the one-drop rule. But medically, who started this particular idea? And it was actually Walter A. Plecker who created this one-drop rule based on hematology, the study of blood and blood diseases and disorders. So Walter A. Plecker actually created that idea of one drop of Black or Negro blood makes you Black. After 1917, sickle cell anemia changed from a clinical identity to a technological one. Emil's test meshed race and disease with identity. So Victor Emil, Walter A. Plecker were very important and very influential in meshing race and disease, especially when it comes to sickle cell anemia. Emil's test was used to search for quote unquote Negro blood and ancestry, which continued the racial thinking of eugenic racial origins and illness. Individuals categorized as white had sickle cell anemia, but for these white individuals, the classification was different. Sickling for whites was not a matter of illness, but a question of racial purity. I could say that again, that sickling for whites was not a matter of illness, but a question of racial purity. The consequence of being white with sickle cell anemia was the stigma of being associated with Blackness and to be socially outcasted and medically contagious. This stigma of Negro blood permeated well into the mid-20th century. And it permeated in World War II. As you see in front of you, a June 1942, or as you see a 1945, editorial by the New York Times called Blood and Prejudice reported the American Red Cross segregated, and I'll repeat that again, segregated the blood donated by Blacks and whites. The American Red Cross's Negro blood and non-Negro blood policy, which the American Red Cross labeled bags of blood by racial distinction and separated them for blood transfusions. Such eugenic blood ideology was counterproductive in the World War II era. The notion of Jim Crow medicine, separate but equal, in a time of war, of course, demolishes national solidarity and civic engagement. The white soldier died because white blood ran out and he refused to receive Negro blood, or a Black soldier could only receive Negro blood without any other option. Emil's test created an uncomfortable ambiguity to the external concept of racial identity. It awakened a society that the concept of race was not only or not solely Black and white. The variables are historical, geographical, and literally skin deep at the cellular level. Emil's blood test of sickle cell anemia complemented Mendelism to create racial identities and endorse eugenics' role in society towards race and social policies. From the concepts of eugenics to Emil's test, race was a crucial factor in disease discourse and communication. Ironically, race did not construct medical science, but medical science itself constructed race and social policies. In fact, the eugenic concepts of Negro blood shaped insurance and social policies as well. Medical science was the authority in shaping social policies in the early 20th century, which maintained the status quo of race relations and developed the status of biological citizenship for African Americans with or without sickle cell anemia. So this is a history of going into the 1800s in the early to mid 1900s. So let's fast forward to race as myth. And again, this is just a brief history because we literally could be here all night talking about the influence and the impact of eugenics and the impact of race and medicine and disease. But I want to fast forward to race as myth. So since 1950, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, the International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, the American Sociological Association, and the American Anthropological Association all agreed. All of these credible organizations agreed that race is not, and I repeat, is not a proxy for biological explanations and difference for disease. Yet, the concept of race as an explanation for disease is still infiltrating science and medicine in the 21st century. An example of this is the past about 15 years in a drug called ABEL. In June 2005, the FDA approved ABEL as a drug to treat African Americans with heart failure. ABEL made history as the first race-based drug. A little brief history, as you can see on the second point, cardiologist and University of Minnesota professor John CAIN's findings was published in an article entitled Racial Differences in the Response to Therapy for Heart Failure, Analysis of the Vascular Heart Failure Trials, which asserted that ABEL's function or ABEL functions better in African Americans compared to whites. And the article, or this particular article, was a key influence in the FDA's approval, the Food and Drug Administration's approval of this drug called ABEL. There's a long history of this, but it was hugely influential because this drug, ABEL, literally was the first race-based drug. And the issue of the process of this, and I'll be brief because I want to touch a few more other points in about the 10-15 minutes I have left before we have Q&A, is that the clinical trials process of this was very flawed. In a clinical trials process, there's 3 stages. The first stage, of course, you need to have a diverse group or a diverse population. The second stage, of course, you need to test the efficacy and the safety of the drug, right? The efficacy meaning the effectiveness, if this drug is literally good. And how pharmaceutical companies do that is that you have 2 groups. First, you have the group that is actually taking the treatment, and then you have a group that thinks that they're taking the treatment, but they're not. They're taking a sugar pill, basically. And the second group, as we know it today, is the placebo group, right? A group that think they're actually taking the medicine, but they're not. And the reason why we have these 2 groups is to really test the efficacy or the effectiveness of the drug. In the process of ABEL, there was no legitimate efficacy stage or 2 groups that literally said that this particular drug is efficacious solely in Black Americans. There was no group. And actually, the 2 drug elements, or the 2 main ingredients of this drug, hydralazine and isosabordinonitride, those 2 drugs are the 2 main ingredients of ABEL. Those drugs in previous clinical trials that were done by the Army actually were efficacious not only in African Americans, but in all racial demographics, not just African Americans. So this particular drug raised a lot of ethical flags, and it even more perplexing that the FDA actually approved this drug, not because it was efficacious in everyone, which it was proved in earlier trials in the 1980s, but as soon as you slapped on, oh, this drug only is efficacious in African Americans or Black individuals, and it was approved in that particular way, which reasserts race and race as disease, or race's connection to disease. So it was really perplexing that this actually happened. And I could go on and on about this, but we'll continue. I just wanted to provide some background information about this drug. So what is race-based medicine? Race-based medicine, or it's also called or termed race-based therapeutics, is the process by which pharmaceutical companies create a drug that is specifically made for a selected racial group. Now, again, this is problematic because I just mentioned in the 1950s, right? This was what, 70 years ago, 71 years ago, that there are major credible organizations that said there's no connection between race and disease, right? Race or biological difference. But yet in 2005, we have a drug that was made only for Black people, hence reasserting eugenic ideas that we went over. So this is problematic, right? It's kind of like you taking an Advil, right? All of us get headaches, right? And it's kind of like saying, well, because I'm Black, because Dr. Johnson is Black, you only could take the Black Advil, right? And if my friend who's white has a headache, they only could take the white Advil, right? And I have another friend and colleague that is Hispanic, they only could take the Hispanic Advil, which of course is ridiculous. It doesn't matter what skin color you are or what race you are. If you have a headache, you just take Advil, right? But race-based medicine is actually reasserting these eugenic ideas with Bidil and with other race-based therapeutics that are coming out of the pipeline, which again reasserts the connection between race and disease, which again, there is no valid connection. So it continues to reassert these particular ideas. So as we continue, in the American context of race as myth, as we are continuing our conversation, the precedent of racial self-identification or classification was set by these two individuals. It was set by Carl von Linnaeus, individual on the right, and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, individual on the left. Swedish botanist Carl von Linnaeus, known as the father of taxonomy, and taxonomy is a fancy word meaning classification. He's the father of classification, specifically racial classification. Linnaeus created the classification of skin color in the first modern study of man. German anthropologist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach included skin color, skull, and the physiognomy or the facial features of men in 5 categories and coined the term Caucasian from the Caucasus Mountains. So this term Caucasian really was constructed by Blumenbach from the Caucasus or the Caucasus Mountains. And if you literally Google the Caucasus Mountains, it's a mountain range that separates Europe from Asia, right? So there's no really legitimate Caucasian race. It is all socially constructed and made up. And Linnaeus and Blumenbach literally are important figures in the classification of what we now see on job applications and census forms, right? And it's actually Charles B. Davenport, the father of American eugenics. He got these particular classification ideas from these two individuals, Blumenbach and Linnaeus. So here's a short particular history, particularly American eugenic history, on how race and the ideas of race and influencers of race have shaped and molded not just our society, but also the medical establishment and science as a whole. But I am a preacher, so I want to go into some Black theology in response to the monstrosities of eugenics and literally the inhumane ideas of eugenics as a whole. So the late great Dr. James Cone, many coin him to be the father of Black liberation theology. I would not go that far because there's a lot of men and women like Elizabeth Johnson and Angela Davis and so many other great individuals who, Black men and women who really contributed to Black liberation theology. But of course, the late great James Cone, who recently passed in 2018, is an influential figure, so we have to give him credit where credit is due. So the African-American experience is a testimony of a group that unfortunately went through inhumane, social, political, spiritual, economic, and other systemic injustices through lived experiences rooted within American race relations. These realities reflect the lived experience of an oppressed and marginalized group. Thus, Black or Blackness is not just a symbol of oppression, but of empowerment and endurance through the influence of religion and theology. This is what the late Dr. James H. Cone describes as survival theology. In the Black community, so for Dr. Cone, and I quoted him here, theology cannot be separated from the community which it represents. And that is so true. This truth has been evident ever since the establishment of slavery and eugenics. And it is the duty of African Americans to evaluate the implications of our own experiences and to be consistent in our commitment to literally defend our existence. So Black theology analyzes the oppression of Black people affirms the personhood of Black people, and advocates for our social and political liberation. It is an extraordinary task to survive in a situation where one's inevitable and unchanging physical appearance, one's Blackness, is the cause of disease, is the cause of racial aggression, is the cause of literally death. Because of such racial realities, race-based medicine and racism as a whole continues to sustain the labels of race in society and medicine. Black theology gives minorities a voice, asserting skin color does not affirm one's inferiority, superiority, bondage, or freedom. Furthermore, it asserts that skin color is not a marker to illness. Black theology is important, but we also recognize our brown brothers and sisters in Hispanic or Latinx theology. As Dr. Miguel A. de la Torre suggests, liberation is not just a symbol. It should mean a radical break with the status quo, designed to maintain oppressive structures, end quote. So Black theology, as well as Hispanic theology, as survival theology, is a response to the labels of race and illness and racism as a whole by liberating the minority or communities of color, and to participate and speak out against the stigma of racial violence and of racial disease. An example of this is the sacred text between Adam and Eve. In the 1998 Nature article, written by the University of California at Berkeley scientists Dr. Mark Stoneking, Rebecca Cain, and Alan Wilson, reveal unprecedented insight into the etiology or the origins of humanity. Their research uncovered the maternal ancestor of existing humans. This figure was named Mitochondrial Eve or African Eve. According to this article, Africans are the most diverse and Asians the next across all functional regions, which suggests that Africa is a likely source of the human mitochondrial gene pool. In the process of this research, the mitochondrial DNAs of 147 people were drawn from 5 geographic populations and had been analyzed by restriction mapping. All the mitochondrial DNA came from one woman who is postulated to have lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. All populations were examined to have multiple origins, except African populations, implying that each area was colonized repeatedly. What this late 20th century discovery challenged was the perceived whitewashing of biblical figures, which has been ingrained in the European and American biblical narrative for centuries, excluding positive biblical perceptions of African representation. The Book of Origins, of course known as Genesis to the Jews and Christians, illustrated key racial passages that influenced racial discourse in American society. And I know it's about 7:32, and I do have a lot more to say, but I'm going to end with a particular influential passage in Genesis, and then we could open up to Q&A and dialogue. And this particular passage is Cain slaying Abel, right? And this is from the book of Genesis, chapter 4, verses 1 through 15. And this particular narrative illustrates the first children, at least biblically, literally in the Bible or in the Torah, in Canaanite scripture, Cain and Abel. It appears that the first sexual act occurs outside of the garden, but this is not yet entirely clear, right? The name Cain, meaning I have produced, the first older brother in the scriptures, is initially a tiller of the ground like his father, Adam, or Adamai, continuing the troubled relationship between Adam, the ground. This difficulty is based from his father's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. Abel, the younger son, like King David in his youth, was the keeper of the ship, which had less prestige than farming. the narrative continues, right? And we all, for the most, if you are familiar with this passage, Cain and Abel's offering, right? The only difference between the values of the two sacrifices is that Abel offers the firstlings of his particular offering, in contrast to Cain, who offers the fruit, but not the first fruit. So the text implies, and there could be many interpretations of this, but the text implies that Abel gave the freshest offering and Cain gave Yahweh or God the leftovers. As a result, God, really didn't like Cain's offering and blessed Abel's offering. Cain got mad and killed Abel. And as a consequence, Cain had a particular curse, right? They call it the curse of Cain. And this, unfortunately, has been interpreted as black skin. And it is now known in our American history, of course, mismanagement, or the, how can I categorize this? The complete misinterpretation and basically perversion of this scripture to justify slavery, that Black individuals with black skin or brown skin were cursed, and this particular scripture was used as justification that it was in God's will to mistreat people of color, right? What is Black liberation's theology response to that? Well, in a nutshell, before we go into Q&A, because I know it's 7:35 p.m., Black liberation says it doesn't matter what skin color you are, right? We are all children of God. It doesn't matter what any particular, race, class, gender, orientation, sex, whatever makes you you. You are a child of God, and you should not be oppressed or treated in any particular way, shape, or form, right? And this is messed within medicine as well. As Black patients, or as Hispanic patients, or as Asian patients, or any person of color as a patient, you should be treated with human dignity because you are a child of God, right? So this particular message of Black liberation theology transcends theology in itself, but it also permeates well into medicine on treating people in the image of God, the Imago Dei, treating patients, no matter how much money they have, no matter what social class or status that they have, treating them as a beloved human being, treating them as a child of God. So that, I have plenty more to say, but I definitely am going to stop there. Hopefully this presentation was enlightening for each and every one of you. And of course, the book on the right is Medical Stigmata, Race, Medicine, and the Pursuit of Theological Liberation. And I also have another book supporting Black businesses that is also available as well. So thank you so much for everyone listening. Thank you for the opportunity for me to share some of my research. And I will bring this right back to our host, Neen. And again, thank you very much.
You, Kirk, for all of that. I know I have so many questions, but I would like to go to the chat because people have posted some really great questions. From Linda, she says, didn't Hitler learn eugenics from American eugenics?
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that. I wanted to mention that, but when I was reading and looking through my notes, I had to fast forward. You always prepare for 40-minute presentation and you think you have plenty of time, but for those who actually presented before, it goes so quick before you know it. But absolutely. Charles B. Davenport, the founder of American eugenics, which I mentioned in the presentation, influenced Adolf Hitler and European eugenic movements. So that is something very important to mention. And thank you very much, Linda, a colleague and friend of mine, a fellow Drew Theological University, Drew Theological School University alum, mentioned that. Thank you very much. But yes, America has influenced Nazi Germany and Nazism and eugenics in Europe. Yeah,
we have a great question from Odessia as well, and I'm so glad to see her on here.
Yes.
She asks, has eugenics impacted the understanding and treatment of lupus as you have outlined with sickle cell anemia?
Absolutely, right. Because the idea, and even in the New York Times, there have been a few articles that doctors, till this day, in 2020 or 2021, excuse me, believe that race and biology have correlation, right? And that influences diagnoses, that influences treatment, right? And that could lead to negative health outcomes. So yes, absolutely, that is in lupus as well. And these age-old eugenic ideas transform even currently into the understanding of lupus.
Wow. There's so much more. I feel like I wish we had more time that we could dive into this because it's just interesting to see how everything's so interconnected. And Lindsay asks, I'm told my ancestry, Ashkenazi Jew, influences my medical risk profile and find myself wrestling with where that information would belong on paperwork for either a healthcare provider or a government entity.
Mm-hmm.
Please elaborate on the distinction between race and ethnicity. And Lindsay, I understand that the Jewish identity is also connected with this idea of ethnicity and race. It's one of those gray areas. And going back to the census, it's a gray area. So.
Right, and it is a gray area, especially for our Jewish brothers and sisters. Of course, race is based on external traits. And this is basically American understanding of race. It's based on the physiognomy, your facial features, your lips, your nose, hair texture, skin color. That's what race is actually based on, because of course there's no biological preferences. Ethnicity and ancestry, and I had plenty of conversations with colleagues who are rabbis in this. It could, for Jewish, and this is their understanding because I had this question myself. So quoting from the rabbis that I have had this conversation with, for Jewish individuals, it's an overlapping type of history. That's what they use the term overlapping, quote unquote, type of history. So it's not really either or, it could be both and, depending on your unique individual history of your own family tree, your own genealogy. So I'm borrowing that from them based on our conversations.
Great, thank you. And so Lindsay, I guess it's a gray area. It's just one of those things
right.
that nobody can give a direct answer to because of the complexity. So
right. And if you add the factor of religion on there as well, that's another layer within the complexity of Jewish history. Mm-hmm.
And Julia has a great question. She says, so in the development and testing of drugs, the studies are not considered valid unless the test subjects are sufficiently diverse in race, age, and gender. Is this actually for genetic differences or is it race-based?
So the key word is ought to be genetically, or racially and demographically diverse, but it's not because of the history of mistreatment of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinx Americans. There's a lot of hesitancy to even be involved in clinical trials, right? Heck, there's hesitancy right now in those particular communities to get vaccines. People's like, are you taking the vaccine? Oh, I'll wait. I want to make sure nobody grows an extra leg or arm or whatever, right? And we jokingly say that, but literally it's still that fear and concern, that mistrust is still rooted within our communities. I'm not saying that every Black, Hispanic, Asian individual views that way, because that, of course, we're not, Black folks are not monolithic. Latinx folks are not monolithic. Asian folks are not monolithic. So we don't think the same. But we cannot negate the fact that these ideas and this fear is still rooted within these communities. So ideally, should there be more diversity? Yes. Are there challenges? Yes. The reason why is because of this history that has not been, I don't like to even use reconciled. There needs to be repair. There needs to be restitution before, there could be reconciliation. That's a sermon right there. But yeah, because there hasn't been a fully acknowledgement of racism in our country, where I think Black folks are the only ones that really haven't had that national apology, right, compared to other racial groups historically. let's start there of recognizing it first, but it's not even being recognized. And that's just in general. Now, when you deal with medicine in itself, there's even more layers into that. So these are reasons why there should be representation, but there aren't the necessary type of representation because of this history. So yeah.
Yeah. Those are the only questions in the chat. But Kirk, if it's okay, I'd like to ask you a question, and maybe people can think of some more. Again, no question is too taboo. Put it in the chat.
And everyone can unmute yourselves as well. Allow everyone to mute yourself. So you could actually raise your hand and ask questions as well. So
thanks, Kirk. And I wanted to ask, because in your book you talk about medicalization, and right, if you have the book, it's on 89. You say medicalization simply means to make medical. Regular life events like menstruation, birth control, infertility, impotency, childbirth, menopause, aging, and death are now medicalized. As a result, patients are transformed into consumers. I thought this was really important, and are less tolerant dealing with the symptoms of life events. So my question for you is that we're the only country, at least the last time I checked, that advertises pharmaceuticals. So we have commercials for pharmaceuticals. You know, we
Correct.
look up what's wrong with us online.
To create more anxiety already, right?
Exactly. And so would you say, and especially after you talked about, is it Bidil it's pronounced?
Yes, Bidil.
Okay, so especially after something like Bidil comes out, which is like quote unquote made for Blacks, are you saying that kind of this idea of like the patient as a consumer, is that crossing an ethical boundary, and that we are even kind of brought up to see ourselves by race to buy certain things or self-diagnose and then go and tell our doctors what we think we need? Say that's something that's happening?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because we spend the most on healthcare. We spend literally over $1 trillion a year on healthcare, but yet we're not in the top 10 in life expectancy. I'm talking about United States of America, right? We're not in the top 10 of life expectancy. We're not in the top 10 of any real legit indicators of good health. And there's many factors that goes along with that. But one factor is that because our healthcare system really isn't a healthcare system, it's a sick management system, right? And we actually see that even more. I think COVID-19 has really exacerbated that we don't have a system, we have fragmented systems, right? It's not a complete system that, you know, you have to go through all of these hoops and red tape and bureaucracies in order to get vaccines out and in order for things to actually be moving at a fairly quick pace. And that's based on a market-based system, right? That's why drugs, speaking of medicalization means that to make medical. So things that really aren't medically serious, for example, double chin. Double chin, the last time I've checked everyone, is not a dramatic health risk, right? But do they have a drug for that? Yes, they do. It's called Cabela, where you inject your double chin and it gets rid of the double chin. That is a prime example of medicalization. Things that aren't medical, we have a drug for, right? What is that doing, right? It's making, of course, pharmaceutical companies more rich, but it's actually psychologically and socially thinking that something is wrong with us for the littlest thing possible, right? And of course, it's based on a market-based system, right? Because we are consumers. And this element of consumerism has, of course, for the past, I believe, 30 years now, 30 to 40 years, have meshed into medicine, right? So an example would be if, a quick example, and then we'll go into any other comments or questions, is that if we don't like our doctor, well, guess what? You could change your doctor. Why? Because you could find a doctor that wants you to do a particular treatment that another doctor doesn't want you to do. So if you have a doctor that, you know, doesn't want you to do a particular treatment, right, you go to another doctor. You know what we call that? We call it a second opinion, right? And of course, I'm not negating anybody to have a second opinion. You have to do what you feel what's right for your health and for your well-being. I'm not saying that at all, right? But we have that option, right? Because we are consumers. We're not just patients. We could pick and choose which doctors to go, which specialists to go, where to go for treatment, right? And that's based on a market-based type of system, right? And that's partially why things are so expensive, because pharmaceutical companies and healthcare providers can charge whatever they want because there's no cap based on the market-based system. They could charge a fee of what they want to charge you. So all these are interconnected within consumerism, capitalism, which is really American as apple pie, if you will, right? That is also, consumerism also is being translated into higher education as well with students and all, but that's a whole nother story for another day. But to answer your question, yeah.
Great. I'm still looking at the chat. So it looks like we have, Odessia is asking, in what ways do health insurance companies participate in the eugenics project? That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, again, health insurance companies, historically, and I wanted to go, and I touched on this briefly in my presentation, but health insurance companies historically covered African Americans based on disease. So if you had a particular disease, of course, it's illegal now, for the most part, I would say, but based on a particular disease. So if you had sickle cell anemia, then you weren't able to get covered, right? And even before the Affordable Care Act, AKA or otherwise known as the Obamacare, health insurance companies actually can, deny you coverage or alter coverage based on pre-existing conditions. That's illegal now. But prior to the Affordable Care Act, it was okay for health insurance companies to do that. So they played a huge role on, we call it the social determinants of health, the health inequities in communities of color. There's been a bad history on health insurance companies and life insurance companies as well regarding communities of color. So absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have.
Thaddeus? I think Thaddeus had his hand up as well.
Oh, great.
Yes, that's me. Hello, sir.
Hello.
I have a question about moreover like race and genealogy.
Yeah.
Or I guess colorism or your skin tone, not particularly your race. So like in the case of like I think they're from Zimbabwe, like the Limba tribe,
mm-hmm.
like that they had to prove their Jewish heritage through a genealogy test. My question is, I guess, how can you do that? I'm sorry. Like, if genetics have nothing to do with race, how do you prove your ancestry through genealogy?
Right. A lot of that, and I had this conversation. Fortunately, I actually, for those who are chaplains or for those who've been to seminary or ordained in ministry, some of the qualifications is you have to do CPE, which is clinical pastoral education. I had the privilege to do my clinical pastoral education at Jewish Theological School in New York City. So I was probably the only black. I was the only black dude in my class. But I had tons of questions to ask a lot of my Jewish brothers and sisters about this. And they said it's deeply rooted within racism, because there is a Jewish sect that there are black individuals who are legitimately Jewish and they're recognized as Jewish. But this is something within Jewish circles that is highly debated, and it is deeply rooted within racism. And it's not me saying this is based on the conversations I've had from the same tribe you literally talked about in Liberia. Because you can't, again, it's based on these particular nuances of Judaism, right? So from understanding my particular conversation with them and their knowledge of this particular subject, that they are recognized as Jewish. But of course, it is controversy within Jewish circles. Some argue they should be tested. Some argue within Jewish circles that they should not be tested because of the geographical history of where Judaism started, right? And because Africa is included in that particular history, it's no surprise that there are sects, very small sects within the continent of Africa or the country of Liberia, that there are individuals who practice Judaism that are from African ancestry, right? And this goes into, because of course, throughout the history, Jewish diaspora all over the world, all over the globe, but that it also includes parts of Africa. So it is not something that is out of the ordinary, where we have Jewish individuals who are a part of literally legitimately Jewish that are African. So there's no distinction, but it is controversial within Jewish circles. Did I answer your question, Thaddeus?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. I wasn't expecting that question. Good thing I actually inquired with my Jewish brothers and sisters out, because that was a really interesting conversation about that.
May I say something? This is Rhea Levy.
Absolutely, yes.
Actually, there was a documentary on PBS about that, about the Limba tribe, and the fact that they had to prove their Jewishness, even though you know, they grew up with the same customs, but yet they had to prove this, and they are Jewish. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's just, again, that racist ideology to say that you have to, you know, our minds are trained to think that when you think of Jews, you have to think of them as being white.
Right.
And so that's that mentality that has, just like what you just presented with all the, you know, with all the individuals with pertaining to color and Caucasian and Negro and Asians and so forth. All of that has been embedded in our minds for so long, to think that you have to be white in order to be Jewish. So therefore, here you have a tribe in Africa, they have to prove their Jewishness, which is totally absurd.
Right, right. Thank you, Rhea, for your comment. So as I mentioned earlier, and based on what my Jewish brothers and sisters said, for the most part, they are. But again, the challenge is because of the racism within that. So absolutely. Mm-hmm.
We only have 4 minutes left. If no one else has a question, I have one question for you, because I think it points to this intersectionality of issues that we're talking about, of things not just being medical issues, but social problems. So
right, Janine, before you go into that,
sure.
A shameless plug for those who want to get the book. Janine, can you post the because I don't have the link.
Yeah.
You could post the link for everyone who would like to get the book and to explore more on that. I just wanted to mention that because I almost forgot. So there it is. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Janine.
Yeah, no, that's the most important part. So in your book, when you're talking about medicalization, you're saying, I think it's on 90, you say medicalization's fallacy narrowly focuses on the source of the problem in the individual, rather than including the social environment, and calls for medical interventions, not social solutions. And when I read that, I thought about, you know, being from Jersey, I'm thinking about, you know, the kids in Newark that have asthma, right? So you have Black kids, your Latinx kids, you have your Asian populations and white populations too, but predominantly people of color that are experiencing asthma, and it's treated as a medical issue, but they're not acknowledging the fact that you have, you know, pollution. They're not acknowledging the environmental racism that's occurring. So I guess my question to you, and this is a big question, but what do you propose instead of medicalization? Instead of pointing out like just the medical things, how are doctors, or how should we be taking into account the whole picture of someone's whole being, of where they are and their social location and their status, there's, you know, everything that's affecting their lives?
Right. Well, eugenics, especially American Eugenics Record Office, determine where you live, what school you went to, literally your life. And of course, that has influenced into redlining, you know, block busting, white flight, geographical segregation. And as a result of geographical segregation, that created environmental racism, right? Where we have these people historically been in communities for decades, live in a certain area. And guess what? That's where we have, that's where we, you know, build infrastructure to dismantle these communities, right? That's where we build highways, right? Where there's congested traffic, and then there's air pollution, right? That results in asthma, right? And we build industries and chemical plants and all these other different things that are connected, right? So an element of environmental racism comes into play here, right? So we have to be intentional. And I think with the Green New Deal that currently Senate and the House of Representatives are trying to pass, that we're trying to be green and clean energy. Part of that is being inclusive, inviting communities of color who are historically been victims of environmental racism to be, number one, economically a part of it, right? To have jobs and job creation and economic opportunity, but also to be involved in the environment that they're in, so that the monstrosities in the past where communities of color were targeted for racist environmental reasons will not be targeted in the future, right? And that is my short answer, because I know that we're running out of time. But environmental racism is very real, and it's connected to many of the things that we talked about tonight.
Thank you. I was just sharing some of your background in the chat of where you are currently teaching.
Yeah, I teach everywhere, y'all. So,
as Reverend Dr. Johnson said, and this is not shameless self-promotion, this is years of hard work and research. This is his book, Medical Stigmata. It's phenomenal. And it's easy to read. So you do not need to be, if you're worried about a lot of, I don't know, people don't have a lot of time to read is the biggest complaint I have. It's wonderful. It's wonderfully written. And I encourage you all to go out and get it, or it is currently being shipped and hopefully it will be soon cataloged by the end of March for our library. And I know Ray is going to grab a copy for the main branch. So you will be able to read that book for free pretty soon too. But we do encourage you to go buy your copy for your own little libraries at home. And Reverend Dr. Johnson, we're so thankful that you came and you shared this presentation with us, and that you just made this a space where we can ask our questions and dive into conversation. So thank you so much.
No problem. And just call me Kirk. I know the title is all cool, but everybody know me as Kirk. But I do appreciate it, because those titles definitely earned. So, but yeah, it's just call me Kirk. It feels weird. It's like Reverend Doctor, Reverend Doctor, Reverend Doctor. But I appreciate everyone coming. Familiar faces, not so familiar faces. Thank you, and please buy the book. I would love your thoughts on the book. Feel free to email me as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any lasting comments? Ending comments? All right, wonderful. Well, we wish you all a safe, warm night. And also, please visit us at our website. I'm putting it in the chat, bapl.org. Again, the best part, not that there's a lot of good parts of this pandemic, but one of the best is that you can attend an event anywhere from the comfort of your own home. So check out more of our events. We have consistent anti-racist events going on all year long, not just for Black History Month. So please check us out. And thank you, Kirk, for
and I put my email address on here, kirk@peculiar-capital.com. So you guys could shoot me an email, or that's my contact info. So
okay, can you put it in the chat? I'm not seeing it.
I did. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. I guess I'm not seeing it, but okay. All right, well, thank you all so much. And this will be available on YouTube. So if there's something you missed, or if you were scribbling notes and you couldn't write fast enough, this will be up shortly on the library's YouTube page. All right, great. Everyone have a great night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Awesome.
Hey, Jack, good to see you. I didn't know Jack was here. Michelle, thank you.
You're welcome. Very good, Kirk.
Thank you. Susan, thank you. Rosemary, Trinity, everyone. Doug, thank you. Kira, Lindsay, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Kirk. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira. Alonzo, thank you as well.
I'm just hanging back. Hey, Lindsay.
Oh, my Uncle CJ is here too. Thank you, Uncle CJ. Awesome. All right, so I'll talk to you later, all right, Janine?
Okay. Lindsay, feel free to reach out, or I think you still have my email, right?
No, but I can get that by calling the library.
All right, yeah. Let's touch base soon.
All right.
Okay, I didn't
Thank
want to
you again
hang
for
up
the
while y'all
talk.
was talking because I have to. Okay, so I'll see
It's
y'all
okay.
later.
All right, thanks, Kirk. Take care.
All right.
Bye.